It began with a letter that was never meant to become public, a final message quietly sealed among Prince Philip's personal papers. For years, it remained hidden behind layers of protocol, silence, and family loyalty. But when Sophie Wessex reportedly uncovered a forgotten clause buried within its pages, the discovery threatened to reopen old wounds, challenge long-held assumptions, and expose a truth that some believed should have stayed buried forever. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. For decades, Prince Philip was known as the royal family's unshakable constant. Through scandals, constitutional crises, family disputes, and changing generations, he remained a figure who rarely revealed his private thoughts. What he chose to say publicly was often carefully measured. What he kept private was another matter entirely. That is why whispers surrounding a final personal letter allegedly written during the last chapter of his life have sparked such intense fascination. According to reports circulating among royal observers and palace insiders, the document resurfaced during a confidential review of archived family papers, a routine process that was never expected to produce headlines. Yet what began as a simple examination of historical records quickly transformed into something far more unsettling. The letter itself reportedly appeared ordinary at first glance. Family reflections, personal observations, thoughts from a man who had spent more than 7 decades standing beside a monarch and witnessing history unfold from behind palace walls. Nothing about its appearance suggested controversy. Nothing suggested conflict. Yet those familiar with the matter claim that buried deep within the text was a little-known provision that immediately caught attention once it was noticed. The language was subtle, easy to overlook, perhaps even intentionally understated, but according to various interpretations, its implications reached far beyond the pages on which it was written. The first signs that something unusual had been discovered reportedly emerged not through public statements, but through reactions. Senior aides who reviewed the document allegedly displayed an unusual level of concern. Meetings were quietly scheduled. Discussions were held behind closed doors. Individuals who normally treated historical correspondence as little more than archival material suddenly found themselves examining a decades-long trail of family decisions, obligations, and expectations. The atmosphere surrounding the letter reportedly shifted from curiosity to caution almost overnight. At the center of the growing mystery stood Sophie Wessex. Long regarded as one of the most trusted and respected figures within the royal family, Sophie had shared a particularly warm relationship with Prince Philip. Over the years, observers frequently noted the mutual respect that appeared to exist between them. It is this connection, according to persistent whispers, that may explain why she recognized the significance of the clause when others either missed it or underestimated its meaning. What exactly she saw remains the subject of intense speculation, but reports suggest that the wording touched upon themes that Prince Philip valued above almost everything else: duty, inheritance, responsibility, and the future direction of the monarchy itself. As news of the discovery quietly spread among senior family members, questions reportedly began emerging almost immediately. Why had this provision remained undisclosed for so long? Had it been overlooked, or had it simply never been considered relevant until now? Was the clause intended as a personal reflection, or was it meant to serve as guidance for future generations facing challenges Philip himself could already foresee? The absence of clear answers only deepened the intrigue. Every explanation seemed to create new questions. Attempt to understand the letter appeared to uncover another layer of complexity hidden beneath the surface. Meanwhile, despite efforts to contain discussion of the document, rumors reportedly began circulating through palace corridors. Those familiar with royal history understand that secrets rarely remain buried forever. Information moves quietly, passed from conversation to conversation, often gaining momentum long before it reaches the public. This situation appeared no different. Whispers of a forgotten clause, suggestions of an overlooked warning, claims that Philip's final words carried implications nobody fully appreciated at the time. Each version of the story differed slightly, yet all pointed toward the same conclusion. Something significant had been found. What made the situation even more compelling was the timing. The monarchy was already navigating a period of uncertainty and transition. Questions about legacy, succession, public trust, and future leadership dominated discussions surrounding the institution. Against that backdrop, the emergence of a hidden message from one of the most influential figures in modern royal history felt less like a coincidence and more like the opening chapter of a much larger story. A story that seemed destined to force difficult conversations and challenge comfortable assumptions. And as curiosity surrounding the letter continued to grow, attention slowly shifted away from the document itself and toward the man who had written it. Because those searching for answers soon realized that understanding the hidden clause required understanding the circumstances under which it was created. What was happening in Prince Philip's life when those words were written? What concerns occupied his thoughts during those final years? And what future did he believe the royal family was heading toward when he chose to put pen to paper? But the mystery surrounding the hidden clause could not be understood without first revisiting the final months of Prince Philip's life and the concerns that reportedly weighed heavily on his mind. As Prince Philip approached the final chapter of his extraordinary life, those closest to him reportedly noticed a growing urgency in the way he discussed the future. While public attention focused on the monarchy's immediate challenges, Philip was said to be thinking decades ahead about legacy, stability, and the survival of an institution he had spent a lifetime defending. The deeper palace insiders allegedly looked into the circumstances surrounding the hidden clause, the more they found themselves returning to the final years of Prince Philip's life. By that stage, he had already stepped away from public duties, ending a remarkable period of service that had defined much of modern royal history. Yet retirement, according to those familiar with his private routine, did not mean disengagement. If anything, it appeared to sharpen his focus. The public may have seen an aging royal enjoying a quieter existence, but behind the scenes, reports suggest Philip remained intensely interested in the future of the crown and the family that would one day inherit its responsibilities. Those who knew him best often described him as a man who valued duty above comfort and responsibility above personal ambition. That belief reportedly became even stronger during his final years. While others debated headlines, controversies, and short-term challenges, Philip was allegedly preoccupied with larger questions. What would happen when the generation he had helped build was gone? Would future heirs understand the sacrifices required to protect the institution? Could the monarchy survive an era increasingly shaped by celebrity culture, personal branding, and public division? These were not questions with easy answers, but according to persistent whispers from royal circles, they were questions Philip never stopped asking. Reports suggest he devoted considerable time to organizing personal papers, correspondence, and historical records. On the surface, such efforts may have appeared practical, even routine. Yet many now wonder whether there was something more deliberate taking place. Advisors and trusted aides allegedly assisted in cataloging documents that Philip believed carried significance beyond his lifetime. Some contained family memories, others preserved historical context, and according to growing speculation, a select few may have contained guidance intended for future generations facing challenges he could already see approaching. What makes these reports particularly compelling is the atmosphere that reportedly existed within the royal family during those final years. Although public appearances often projected stability, insiders frequently spoke of tensions quietly developing beneath the surface. Different visions for the future, different expectations about duty and privilege, different understandings of what royal service should mean in the 21st century. None of these disagreements necessarily erupted into open conflict at the time, but according to those familiar with the family dynamic, Philip was acutely aware of the pressures building behind palace walls. That awareness may explain why unity reportedly became one of his greatest concerns. Throughout his life, Philip had witnessed how divisions could weaken even the strongest institutions. He had seen personal disputes evolve into public controversies. He had watched loyalty tested and relationships strained. More importantly, he understood that every generation faced its own challenges. The question was never whether difficulties would emerge. The question was whether the family would possess the discipline and sense of purpose necessary to overcome them. According to various accounts, that concern increasingly shaped the thoughts he committed to paper. As researchers and royal commentators revisit his final writings, a recurring theme appears to emerge: responsibility. Again and Again, reports suggest Philip returned to the idea that privilege alone was never enough. Titles could be inherited, status could be granted, wealth could be preserved, but duty had to be embraced, it had to be chosen. Those familiar with his philosophy argue that he viewed service as the true foundation of royal life. Without it, everything else risked becoming hollow. Without it, even the most prestigious position could lose its meaning. Suddenly, the existence of the hidden clause begins to feel less accidental and far more intentional. If Philip was indeed reflecting on questions of legacy, unity, and responsibility during his final years, then perhaps the provision discovered by Sophie was not merely a forgotten paragraph buried in an old letter. Perhaps it was the culmination of years of thought. A carefully considered message from a man determined to leave behind more than memories. A message designed not for the present, but for a future he would never live to see. And as that possibility gained traction among those examining the document, attention shifted from why the clause existed to how it was written. Because the more closely people reportedly studied the language, the more they began to suspect that Philip had concealed something profound beneath words that initially appeared straightforward. What seemed like simple advice suddenly carried the weight of something much larger, something deliberate, something calculated, something waiting patiently to be discovered at precisely the right moment. Yet what seemed like a simple expression of wisdom soon appeared to contain something far more significant, something carefully concealed within the wording itself. At first glance, the passage appeared ordinary. It sat quietly among pages filled with reflections, guidance, and family sentiments. But according to whispers circulating within royal circles, one paragraph carried language so specific and so unusual that it transformed the entire meaning of the letter. Once its implications were fully understood. The more people allegedly examined Prince Philip's final letter, the harder it became to dismiss the possibility that something important had been hidden in plain sight. What initially appeared to be a collection of personal reflections suddenly seemed layered with a deeper purpose. The clause that Sophie reportedly identified was not highlighted, emphasized, or separated from the rest of the document. Instead, it was woven seamlessly into a broader discussion about family duty, responsibility, and the burdens that accompany privilege. That subtlety may have been precisely why it remained unnoticed for so long. According to those familiar with the growing debate, the wording was remarkably understated. There were no dramatic declarations, no explicit instructions that immediately demanded attention, no language that would have caused alarm when first read. Yet buried within the carefully chosen phrases was something that reportedly stopped experienced readers in their tracks once they began examining the text more closely. What seemed straightforward at first glance suddenly appeared open to multiple interpretations, each carrying consequences that stretched far beyond the original letter itself. That realization reportedly triggered a wave of quiet consultations. Legal experts were allegedly invited to review the wording. Constitutional advisors examined its phrasing. Trusted aides compared different interpretations and attempted to understand what Prince Philip may have intended when he committed those thoughts to paper. The challenge was not determining whether the clause possessed legal authority. By most accounts, it did not. The challenge was determining whether it carried something potentially even more powerful within the context of the royal family: moral authority. For generations, the monarchy has operated not only through written laws and official decrees, but also through traditions, expectations, and unwritten. To 10 understandings passed from one generation to the next. Palace insiders reportedly recognized this distinction immediately. Even if the clause lacked formal legal force, it could still influence how future generations interpreted duty, loyalty, and responsibility. In some ways, that made it even more significant. Laws can be amended, rules can be revised, but deeply held beliefs about what previous generations expected often become part of a family's identity. And according to growing speculation, Philip may have understood that better than anyone. As discussions continued behind closed doors, Sophie reportedly found herself at the center of the unfolding mystery. Sources suggest she was among the first to appreciate that the significance of the clause was not found in what it openly stated, but in what it quietly implied. Those who knew Philip well often described him as direct, practical, and deeply strategic. He rarely wasted words. Every sentence served a purpose. Every observer, Tion reflected careful thought. If he chose to include a provision that could easily be overlooked, many now wonder whether that decision was intentional from the very beginning. The implications quickly became difficult to ignore. According to various interpretations circulating within royal circles, the clause appeared to establish expectations for future generations rather than provide instructions for the present. It seemed less concerned with immediate circumstances and more focused on principles that would endure long after its author was gone. Duty before privilege, responsibility before entitlement, service before personal ambition. These themes reportedly echoed throughout Philip's later writings, making the discovery feel less like an isolated statement and more like the culmination of beliefs he had spent a lifetime defending. Yet not everyone allegedly agreed on what the passage truly meant. Some viewed it as a simple expression of personal philosophy. Others believed it presented a carefully crafted warning directed toward future heirs. A few reportedly argued that it challenged assumptions that had quietly shaped royal decision-making for years. The disagreement itself became part of the story, because the more interpretations emerged, the more obvious it became that the clause was forcing people to revisit questions they thought had already been settled. That uncertainty transformed the atmosphere surrounding the letter. What had begun as an archival discovery evolved into a broader conversation about legacy. Family members reportedly found themselves reflecting on long-held beliefs. Advisors reconsidered historical decisions through a new lens. Observers began asking whether Philip had anticipated challenges that were only now becoming visible. And perhaps most intriguingly, some wondered whether the hidden clause had been waiting all along for a particular moment in history, a moment when its meaning would finally become impossible to ignore. As those questions spread through palace corridors and private discussions intensified, the focus shifted away from the document itself and toward the people now interpreting it. Because once different members of the royal family began applying their own understanding to Philip's words, the discovery stopped being about the past. It became about the present. It became about relationships, loyalties, and competing visions for the future of the monarchy. And suddenly, disagreements that once seemed manageable started to look very different. And as interpretations of Philip's words spread among senior royals, old divisions suddenly took on an entirely new meaning. Few people understood Prince Philip's thinking better than Sophie Wessex. Often described as one of the late Duke's most trusted confidants, she occupied a unique position within the family. That connection reportedly gave her insight others lacked, and may explain why she was the first to recognize what the hidden clause truly scented. As debates surrounding the mysterious passage intensified, one name continued to surface in nearly every discussion: Sophie Wessex. While others focused on the wording itself, many royal observers began asking a different question entirely. Why was Sophie the person who immediately recognized the significance of the clause when so many others had apparently overlooked it? The answer, according to those familiar with the family's internal dynamics, may lie in a relationship that had been quietly built over decades. Unlike many members of the royal family who entered Philip's world through formal obligations and public expectations, Sophie reportedly earned something far more valuable than his trust. Throughout the years, insiders frequently suggested that the Duke of Edinburgh viewed her not simply as a family member, but as someone who genuinely understood the principles he spent a lifetime defending: duty, loyalty, service, resilience. These were not abstract concepts to Philip. Reports suggest he believed Sophie shared that understanding in a way few others did. That bond allegedly became even stronger during the later years of his life. As public attention increasingly shifted toward younger generations and headline-making controversies, Sophie remained a steady presence. Never seeking the spotlight, never demanding attention, she quietly continued her work while maintaining close connections with senior members of the family. According to persistent palace whispers, Philip appreciated that consistency. In an era often dominated by publicity and personal narratives, Sophie represented something he deeply valued: reliability. It is against that backdrop that her role in the discovery begins to take on greater significance. Sources suggest Sophie was involved in reviewing family records, personal correspondence, and archived materials connected to Philip's legacy. At first, the process appeared routine. Historical documents are regularly organized, cataloged, and preserved. Yet somewhere within that review, attention reportedly turned toward the letter that would soon become the center of intense private discussion. What happened next remains largely hidden from public view, but accounts from royal commentators suggest Sophie immediately sensed there was more to the document than others initially realized. The discovery allegedly attracted attention with surprising speed. Household officials who reviewed the clause reportedly recognized that it could not simply be dismissed or ignored. Questions began circulating. Interpretations emerged. Advisors were consulted. What had started as a quiet archival matter was rapidly becoming a topic of serious internal examination. And according to various reports, Sophie was among those urging caution before anyone rushed to conclusions. That caution proved important because the clause appeared capable of supporting multiple interpretations. Some viewed it as a philosophical statement. Others believed it contained guidance directed toward future generations. A few reportedly argued it represented an implicit warning about the dangers of confusing privilege with responsibility. Each interpretation carried different implications, and each threatened to reshape how Philip's final wishes were understood. As a result, discussions reportedly became increasingly intense. Behind closed doors, family members allegedly responded in very different ways. Some were said to view the passage as a profound reflection of Philip's lifelong values. Others questioned whether too much significance was being attached to a single paragraph. Still others reportedly wondered whether the timing of the discovery itself carried meaning. Why now? Why had the clause remained unnoticed for years only to emerge during a period already filled with uncertainty about the monarchy's future? The absence of definitive answers only deepened the intrigue. As these conversations unfolded, Sophie's position reportedly became more central. Not because she claimed to possess all the answers, but because many believed she understood Philip's mindset better than almost anyone else still living. Her familiarity with his character, his priorities, and his concerns gave weight to her perspective. Gradually, the discussion shifted away from what the clause literally said and toward what Philip may have intended when he wrote it. In that sense, Sophie was no longer simply the person who found the passage. She had become a key figure in deciphering its meaning. Yet the more attention the clause received, the more another mystery began to emerge. If the provision carried such significance, if it truly reflected concerns that Philip considered important enough to preserve for future generations, then why had it remained hidden for so long? Why had nobody raised questions about it earlier? And perhaps most intriguingly of all, was its long silence accidental or exactly as Philip intended? But as the clause gained attention, nation, an even larger question emerged. Why had nobody addressed it publicly before now? The moment the hidden clause entered private discussions, a familiar pattern reportedly unfolded inside palace corridors. Meetings multiplied. Advisors were consulted. Documents were revisited. What had begun as an archival discovery was rapidly becoming a sensitive issue capable of influencing relationships, expectations, and the monarchy's carefully managed public image. The question that had lingered in the background for years was suddenly impossible to ignore. If Prince Philip had deliberately included a clause carrying deeper meaning, then understanding that meaning was no longer simply a matter of historical curiosity. It became a matter of interpretation, influence, and legacy. According to reports circulating among royal observers, the atmosphere inside senior royal circles shifted almost immediately. What had started as a quiet conversation reportedly evolved into a complex review involving trusted aides, legal advisors, constitutional experts, and family representatives, all attempting to answer the same fundamental question. What exactly had Philip intended to communicate? Sources suggest that senior household officials began examining not only the letter itself, but also related correspondence, personal notes, and archived records connected to Philip's final years. The objective, according to Palace Whispers, was not to uncover hidden instructions, but to establish context. Every document suddenly appeared relevant. Every reference to duty, responsibility, and future generations attracted renewed scrutiny. The deeper the review went, the more complicated the situation reportedly became. Instead of producing certainty, each new discovery seemed to create fresh uncertainty. Part of the challenge stemmed from the fact that the clause itself appeared open to multiple interpretations. Some believed it represented a moral framework designed to guide future generations through difficult periods. Others argued that Philip was expressing personal concerns rather than offering institutional guidance. A third group reportedly viewed the passage as something more profound, a subtle attempt to address divisions he feared might one day threaten family unity. None of these interpretations could be definitively proven, yet none could be completely dismissed either. That ambiguity transformed the clause into a source of growing fascination. As discussions continued, reports suggest differing viewpoints began emerging among family members themselves. While nobody publicly addressed the matter, insiders allegedly described varying reactions behind closed doors. Some reportedly viewed the clause as entirely consistent with Philip's lifelong commitment to service and discipline. Others questioned whether too much significance was being attached to a single passage. A few allegedly worried that public attention surrounding the discovery could encourage endless speculation, and about motives, intentions, and historical decisions. The disagreement was not necessarily about the words themselves. It was about what those words represented. That debate soon expanded beyond the immediate family. Historical precedents reportedly became part of the conversation. Advisors examined how previous generations of royals had communicated important values through private correspondence and personal writings. Comparisons were allegedly drawn to letters, memoranda, and reflections left behind by influential figures throughout royal history. The goal was to determine whether Philip's actions followed a familiar pattern or represented something unique. Yet the more comparisons were made, the more observers reportedly concluded that this situation stood apart. The hidden clause seemed to occupy a category all its own. What made the discussion particularly sensitive was the broader context in which it unfolded. The monarchy was already facing difficult questions about its future. Public expectations were changing. New generations were assuming greater responsibilities. Debates about tradition, modernization, and institutional identity were becoming increasingly prominent. Against that backdrop, the discovery of a potentially significant message from Prince Philip felt less like an isolated event and more like an intervention from the past. Suddenly, conversations about the future direction of the monarchy became intertwined with attempts to understand one man's final reflections. Outside palace walls, speculation reportedly began accelerating as rumors spread among journalists, commentators, and royal watchers. Fragments of information emerged. Anonymous sources offered competing interpretations. Observers attempted to piece together a story from limited details. The mystery surrounding the clause only increased its appeal. The less people knew, the more determined they became to understand its significance. Every unanswered question fueled another theory. Theory generated another round of discussion. Meanwhile, pressure reportedly continued building within royal circles. Not necessarily pressure to release the document publicly, but pressure to establish a clearer understanding of what Philip had intended. The uncertainty itself had become a problem. As long as interpretations remained divided, the clause would continue casting a shadow over conversations about legacy, responsibility, and the future of the institution. And with each passing day, one realization became increasingly difficult to escape. The true importance of the discovery was never rooted in legal authority, constitutional procedure, or official power. Instead, it appeared to be rooted in something far more enduring: a message. A warning. Perhaps even a final lesson from a man who had spent a lifetime observing the strengths and weaknesses of the monarchy from closer than almost anyone else. The hidden clause may not have changed laws. It may not have altered success. It may not have carried formal authority, yet its influence seemed to grow precisely because it spoke to something deeper than rules. Yet the true impact of the discovery was never about legal authority, it was about the message Prince Philip appeared determined to leave behind. The deeper investigators reportedly looked into Philip's final words, the clearer one possibility became. Perhaps the hidden clause was never intended to distribute wealth, titles, or property. Perhaps its purpose was far more powerful: to remind future generations that privilege without duty was a threat to everything the monarchy represented. As analysis of Prince Philip's final letter reportedly continued behind closed doors, a striking shift began to emerge in how senior observers interpreted the document. What had once been treated as a potential administrative curiosity slowly transformed into something far more profound. The language of the clause, once examined in detail, appeared less concerned with material inheritance and far more focused on something intangible yet deeply influential: responsibility. Not as a suggestion, not as a courtesy, but as a defining principle that, according to those studying the text, sat at the very heart of Philip's worldview. This interpretation immediately reframed everything that had come before it. Philip's life had never been shaped by comfort or ease. From his earliest years through decades of service beside Queen Elizabeth II, he was known for an uncompromising belief that the monarchy survived not through privilege alone, but through disciplined duty. Those who worked closely with him often described a man who was direct, unyielding at times, but deeply committed to the idea that royal life was not a reward, it was a responsibility carried on behalf of something far larger than the individual. That philosophy, long visible in his public role, now appeared to echo even more strongly within the hidden clause. Reports suggest that senior members of the royal household began to reconsider the wording through this lens. What initially seemed ambiguous now appeared deliberate. The clause, according to interpretations circulating within royal circles, did not simply reference family continuity. It appeared to reinforce expectations that each generation must earn its position through service rather than assume it through birthright alone. In that sense, it was not about what was passed down materially, but about what was demanded morally. And that distinction, subtle at first glance, began to carry enormous weight once fully understood. For those who had studied Philip's public life, this interpretation aligned closely with his known philosophy. He had never been interested in ceremonial symbolism without substance. Throughout his decades of service, he repeatedly emphasized practicality, discipline, and accountability. Royal observers often noted that he measured success not by public admiration, but by contribution. Whether through the modernization of royal institutions or his tireless support for charitable causes, Philip consistently reinforced the idea that legitimacy came from action, not inheritance alone. Seen in that context, the clause began to resemble less of a legal provision and more of a distilled expression of everything he had stood for. Yet even as this interpretation gained traction, it also raised difficult questions. If the clause was indeed intended as a moral directive, then how should it be applied in a modern monarchy facing rapidly evolving expectations? Could a message rooted in discipline and traditional duty still resonate in an era defined by transparency, public accountability, and changing cultural values? Or did it risk becoming symbolic rather than functional, respected in principle but softened in practice? These were not abstract debates. They reportedly became central points of discussion among those responsible for interpreting Philip's legacy. Within the famille, reactions were said to vary, reflecting different perspectives on the monarchy's future path. Some reportedly viewed the clause as a powerful reminder of continuity, a reaffirmation that the institution must remain anchored in service above self. Others, however, questioned whether its meaning had been shaped by hindsight, with too much weight being placed on a single passage of text. Still others saw it as something more complex, a challenge rather than an instruction, designed not to dictate outcomes but to provoke reflection across generations. Despite these differences, one reality appeared increasingly difficult to ignore. The clause had shifted from a private reflection into a symbolic reference point. It was no longer just about what Prince Philip had written. It was about what he represented. His voice, though no longer present, seemed to re-emerge through the interpretation of his words, influencing conversations about leadership, identity, and the delicate balance between tradition and adaptation within the monarchy. As this symbolic weight grew, so too did Philip's perceived presence in the broader narrative of the royal family's evolution. His influence, once considered historical, began to feel unexpectedly contemporary. Decisions, discussions, and disagreements were now being viewed through the prism of his philosophy. Whether intended or not, the clause had become a mirror reflecting the ongoing tension between inherited privilege and earned responsibility. And that symbolic importance would soon lead many to reconsider Philip's role in shaping the monarchy long after his passing. What started as a forgotten paragraph had evolved into something much larger, a debate about legacy itself. As discussions intensified, the hidden clause became a mirror reflecting deeper anxieties about succession, family unity, and the future direction of the crown in an era of unprecedented change. As the implications of Prince Philip's hidden clause continued to ripple, through private royal discussions, the atmosphere surrounding it reportedly shifted once again. What had begun as a quiet matter of interpretation had now expanded into something far more complex, a conversation not only about what Philip wrote, but about what the monarchy itself was becoming. The clause was no longer being treated as an isolated discovery. Instead, it was becoming a symbolic battleground where competing visions of royal identity quietly collided. At the center of these discussions lay a growing tension between continuity and change. On one side, there were those who viewed Philip's words as a reaffirmation of traditional values: discipline, service, hierarchy, and restraint. On the other, there were voices reportedly suggesting that the monarchy must evolve in order to survive modern scrutiny, public expectation, and shifting cultural landscapes. The clause, depending on how it was interpreted, seemed capable of supporting both positions. That duality made it not just significant, but potentially transformative. Observers within royal circles allegedly began drawing comparisons between generations, revisiting the stark contrast between the disciplined structure of Philip's era and the more emotionally expressive, media-driven environment of the present day. These comparisons were not always comfortable. They reportedly reopened long-standing debates about what royal duty should look like in practice. Was it defined by strict adherence to tradition, or by the ability to adapt while maintaining institutional integrity? The clause, in its ambiguity, appeared to force these questions into the open. As these interpretations spread, underlying family tensions reportedly became more visible in conversation, even if not publicly acknowledged. Every faction seemed to find something different in Philip's words. For some, it was a reminder of unity, a call to preserve the institution above personal difference. For others, it raised concerns about how loyalty is defined within a modern monarchy, whether loyalty means obedience to tradition or commitment to a shared future that may require uncomfortable change. The lack of consensus did not weaken the clause's importance, it intensified it. Amid this growing complexity, Sophie's role reportedly gained even greater significance. No longer viewed simply as the person who discovered the clause, she was increasingly seen as someone who had bridged two worlds: the personal legacy of Prince Philip and the institutional reality of the royal household. Her understanding of his character, combined with her proximity to both past and present members of the family, placed her in a uniquely influential position. According to whispers within royal commentary circles, her interpretation carried weight precisely because it was believed to reflect Philip's intent rather than external speculation. At the same time, Philip's presence in the narrative appeared to grow stronger, not weaker, despite his absence. His influence, once thought to belong firmly to history, now seemed to extend into the present moment through the continued reinterpretation of his final words. Every discussion about the clause became, in effect, a discussion about him, his philosophy, his expectations, and the enduring framework he had spent decades reinforcing. The more people analyzed the passage, the more they found themselves revisiting his broader legacy as a guiding force behind the institution. What made the situation even more compelling was the realization that the discovery had not settled anything. Instead, it had opened a deeper layer of uncertainty. Rather than providing closure, the clause appeared to have revived unresolved questions about identity and direction. It forced those involved to confront not only what Philip believed, but whether those beliefs could still define a monarchy operating in a very different world. That tension between reverence for the past and pressure from the present became a defining feature of the entire debate. As conversations continued to evolve, one idea began to surface repeatedly among those studying the matter: that Philip may not have intended to resolve anything at all. Instead, the clause may have been designed to endure as a question rather than an answer, compelling each generation to confront its own understanding of duty and responsibility. If true, that interpretation reframed the entire discovery. It was no longer a document to be decoded and closed. It was a challenge that remained open by design. And that realization led to an even more unsettling possibility that the hidden clause may ultimately reveal less about the past than about the future. Years after Prince Philip's passing, a single overlooked passage has reportedly achieved what few documents ever can. It has reignited conversations, challenged assumptions, and forced the royal family to confront questions that never truly disappeared. Whether intended as a warning, a guide, a final act of guardianship, its significance continues to grow. In the quiet years following Prince Philip's death, the royal household had expected his influence to settle into history preserved in ceremonies, remembered in tributes, and confined to memory. Yet according to persistent royal commentary and whispered interpretations within expert circles, one forgotten passage in his final correspondence refused to remain dormant. Instead, it resurfaced as something far more powerful than anyone initially anticipated. Not as a legal instruction, not as a formal directive, but as a living idea that continued to shape how his legacy was understood. The discovery reportedly shifted how Sophie Wessex's earlier role was viewed as well. What had once been described as a careful reading of archived material now appeared, in hindsight, to be a pivotal moment in the preservation of meaning itself. Her recognition of the clause was no longer treated as a simple observation, but as a turning point. Not that allowed the document to escape obscurity and re-enter the core of royal discussion. Through her involvement, the letter transformed from a private reflection into a subject of institutional reflection. Over time, the clause itself began to carry a symbolic weight that extended beyond its original wording. It became less about what it explicitly stated and more about what it represented. A philosophy of continuity, discipline, and responsibility that had defined Philip's public life. Those who studied his legacy often pointed out that he never separated duty from identity. For him, service was not an obligation imposed from above, it was a personal standard, an unspoken contract between the crown and those who carried it forward. The clause, in this interpretation, felt like an echo of that belief system, preserved in a form subtle enough to survive scrutiny yet strong enough to endure interpretation. Royal observers reportedly continued to debate its meaning, not because the text itself is unclear, but because its implications stretch in multiple directions. Some see it as a moral reminder aimed at future generations who might risk drifting from the principles that once held the institution together. Others interpret it as a reflection of concern and acknowledgement that even the strongest traditions can weaken if responsibility is separated from privilege. And still others argue that its true significance lies not in interpretation at all, but in the fact that it continues to provoke interpretation decades after it was written. Within the family, according to ongoing commentary from those familiar with royal dynamics, the clause has also become a point of quiet reflection. It is said to prompt reconsideration of Philip's foresight, particularly his ability to anticipate challenges that were not yet visible during his lifetime. His long view of the monarchy, shaped by wartime experience, constitutional duty, and decades of observation, now appears, in retrospect, to have extended further than many previously understood. What once seemed like routine reflection now feels, to some, like strategic foresight embedded within personal writing. At the same time, the story underscores a broader truth about legacy itself. Written words, especially those left behind by figures of authority, rarely remain static. They evolve as they are reinterpreted, re-examined, and reintroduced into new contexts. In Philip's case, the clause has become more than a fragment of text. It has become a lens through which the monarchy continues to examine itself. Its ambiguity is precisely what allows it to endure. Its silence is what gives it force. Yet despite all analysis, discussion, and reinterpretation, essential questions remain unresolved. Was the clause meant as instruction, reflection, or warning? Was it designed to guide, or simply to provoke thought? And perhaps most importantly, did Philip intend for it to remain open-ended, ensuring that its meaning would grow with time rather than settle into certainty? These unanswered questions ensure that the mystery remains alive, continuing to shape conversation long after its discovery. And as long as it does, the royal family finds itself returning again and again to the same realization that some legacies are not preserved through clarity, but through complexity. Some messages are not meant to close debates, but to keep them alive across generations. Because in the House of Windsor, some of the most powerful decisions are not announced from palace balconies or written into official decrees. They are whispered through generations, waiting for the moment when someone finally uncovers the truth. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.